Okay, in this video I want to talk specifically about color for the web and the different ways we can specify colors. So I've got a simple file set up here, and first thing we'll talk about is just two different color things we can set. When we just use the word color, it's going to refer to the color of the type. And when I set background color, I'm talking about the box, whether it's a paragraph, a div, a heading, all those things that I've called boxes. Again, box is not a real thing, but they're all basically boxes. We're setting the background color of that box. So here I've got the body, and I've said make the background color red. So we can use words, and there's a range of words, and we know that when we, for instance, I'll delete that and go back to just when I hit my colon, it pops up a list of words. So these are all valid choices, and I can pick whatever. And once I've typed it in, put the semicolon at the end, it changes the color. And so let's make that something a little easier to look at. Okay. A couple things to notice here just in terms of the hierarchy as well. Here I've set the type color of the body element to pink. But in my H1 I've set the type color to black. So that overrides the general command pink because it's more specific. The body is a more general tag. It's body all the way down to end body, and headline is inside of that, so it's a more of local tag. So the more explicit or local something is, it has more power. Here I set the color, the type color, for the content of a div to chocolate. That's referring to this text. And notice my text in the page itself that's not in the div. So if I look down here, that's my text that's not inside of a div. Its color is pink because that's our general command. Is if you don't get a more local color designation, we're going to use this color of the type to pink. And then we've got the background color. Again, that refers to the box itself. Notice that my headline, the background color, I made it white. It goes all the way across the screen. There's this little bit of margin left around the edge, and that's coming in from the body. So if we wanted to take that away, we would set the margin to 0. And then that white space goes away. So these block elements that I'm calling boxes, by default they fill the whole width of the window. We can also add a border. So here I put a border. When we do a border, we specify whether we want like a solid line or a dotted line. There's a few values that can have. We give it a thickness, and then I give it a color. And again, I can use words, and then we're going to look at other ways we can do that. So let's talk a little bit about RGB color. And so I'll use this background thing. So another thing we can do is type RGB. It stands for red, green, blue, and then we give it 3 numbers. So I'll just put in some arbitrary numbers here. And again, when I finish that off, it's made a color. So I give it a value for red, a value for blue, and a value for green. When I hover over it, it shows me that color. What are these numbers? They are numbers between 0 and 255, which seems kind of arbitrary, but there's a reason for it. And so to think a little bit more clearly about the RGB colors, we're going to go to Photoshop here. So I've made a simple document in Photoshop, and I've opened the color panel. And I've gone under the settings, and I'm using RGB sliders. There's some other sliders here. We'll talk about those as well, but for now we want to use RGB sliders. And notice that the sliders go from, if I zoom in on this number, they go from 0 to 255. So it's like a dimmer switch, kind of. We're turning up the red pixels in this case, and if I turn off the green, and I turn off the blue, and I turn up the red, I can see the resulting color is going to be red. And so there are all these different combinations of numbers that will give us different colors. This is additive color, which is a little different than mixing paint. We're mixing light together. And so if I turn up, for instance, red and green, the result is yellow. We can't get yellow by mixing pigments together. It's a primary color. In this system, it's a secondary color. If I turn up the red pixels and the blue pixels, I get a color called magenta. And if I turn up the green and blue and turn off the red, I get a color called cyan. Those may sound somewhat familiar because in printing we use cyan, magenta, yellow, and black for our main ink colors. So there's a complementary relationship between the additive and subtractive colors. If I turn up all the values as high as they go, I get white, because white light is basically a mix of all the colors. So RGB is this system we use for screen colors, which means our monitors, your phones, anything you're looking at, projectors, anything you're looking at on a screen is using RGB color. So we can use those numbers to set things. You can also use this to kind of experiment and see what colors things are. If I click in the space down here with my eyedropper, it will pick up that color and show me these RGB numbers. So if I put in these numbers, let's pick a green here. So I say turn off the red, 0, green 171, that makes sense, it's got a lot of green in it, and blue 99, I get a shade of green. And as expected, when I get into the oranges and reds, I've got a lot of red and a little green, because remember, red and green paint would make like a muddy color. Here, the more I mix red and green, the closer I get to yellow. Okay. So orange is going to be some mix of red and green. Okay. Yellow is going to be a mix of red and green. As I turn down the red, it starts going towards green. So if I turn off the blue. So again, a different way of looking at color than we're used to when we think about paint and pigments. But you can also set the sliders to web color sliders. When I do that, I get an even stranger mix of numbers, and it's got these little click points. This is a throwback to early days of the web when we used more limited color systems. And Photoshop still has it in here, but we don't really need that right now. We'll talk about that again in a minute, but I'll go back to my RGB sliders. So for instance, if I make a marquee here, and I pick a color, this is 0, 170, 218. If I want to like see a bigger preview of this little swatch, I could hold down the Option key and hit Delete. Option Delete in Photoshop fills the marquee with the current foreground color. So there's my foreground color, and also shows up here. As I change these numbers, I'm changing the foreground color here. So I can just see what it looks like. If I open an image, a photo or something, I could use my eyedropper to pick up colors and just see what they look like. So if I go back to here, so that's another option, is to put in RGB numbers. So I've got a div, it's got a background color, so I'm going to replace that with one of my new RGB numbers, GB, and I'll do 100, 100, 20. So that's some red, some green, and just a little bit of blue. So it's going to be this kind of dark green color. As I turn up these numbers, it'll get brighter. So 200, it's redder, right? If I make this number, it's going to get closer to yellow as I make this number bigger. As I start making this number bigger, it's going to make the end result lighter. So if I go 200, 200, I've got kind of a yellow, slightly greenish, because we've got a lot of green in it as well. And as I start making this number bigger, it gets lighter and lighter. And if I go all the way to 200, it's actually a shade of gray because I've got all the light values set to the same thing. So I'm going to put that back down to something a little darker. An addition we can do to this when we're using the RGB specification is we can put an A in here. Okay. A is transparency. So that's an alpha value, and I could put something like 0.5. In this case, it wants a number between 0 and 1. So it's making this color transparent. So that means a little bit of the blue background is actually showing through, because the background of the whole page is this color we put up here. And so that's affecting this color because we've given it a transparency. And basically, the lower the number, the more transparent it is, and the higher the number, more opaque it is. So 0 would be completely transparent, so you wouldn't see it, and 1.0 would be completely opaque. So we can set alpha values. You can do that for any of your color specifications. You can do that for type, you can do it for backgrounds, borders, etc. Anything where you're setting color values. Another way of specifying colors, and I'm going to mention this because you will see it sometimes in existing code, if you're looking at somebody's web page and they put in a color, is to use something called hexadecimal numbers. And I'll just type one in so you see what it looks like. But I start with the hashtag, and then I give it 6 numbers. The first 2 numbers, let's say 90, refer to the red. The next 2 numbers, the green, so 90, 90, and the last 2 numbers, the blue. And again, I'm affecting the headline up here. So I've turned up the red and green. I'm getting this kind of olivey color. But what looks a little weird and is not obvious is I could do FF, and I've got yellow. Okay. The reason these are called hexadecimal numbers is they use a base 16 counting system instead of the decimal system that we are used to, which uses a base 10. Because we run out of regular number symbols on our keyboard as we go above 9, right? 10 we have to write 1 0, but in hexadecimal the decimal equivalent 10 is actually still a single digit. So we use the letter A. So A is 10, B is 11, C is 12, etc. up to F, which is 15. So the F is 15 plus the 0 means we've got 16 symbols to use for numbers. So FF numerically is equivalent to 255 in RGB numbers. So this is just a kind of engineering way of specifying colors. In the early days of the web, this is what we had to do. So we had to get used to at least a little bit thinking of these color values in terms of these hexadecimal numbers. If we go back to Photoshop for a second, we can see when I go to the web color sliders, it's using these hexadecimal numbers. So 96 is still 96, but CF means the first digit is C, which is 14, and the second digit is F, which is 15. So this is a number that's getting closer to 255. When I go all the way up, I can see that my big number is FF, which is in hexadecimal is equivalent to 255. So kind of a confusing system, but they're exactly the same numbers. It's just a different way of visually representing the numbers. And fortunately, we can use RGB values. And so I mention this not to overly confuse you, but because you may see these hexadecimal numbers in a lot of existing code if you view source on a web page or something. All right, so let's minimize that. And again, we can do the alpha value. There are even some other ways we can specify colors for the web. We can use something called hue, saturation, and lightness, just so you can see it happening. HSL. This wants three numbers. The first one is the hue. That's going to be a number between 0 and 360, which is confusing. It's in degrees around the color circle. The next number is saturation, so I'm going to make it 100%. And the last number is the brightness, and I'm going to make it 50%. So, again, if you're familiar with color wheels and stuff, HSL can be useful. So again, the first number is how far around the color circle we're going. Red happens to be at 0, and as you progress, so you go through orange, yellow, green, blue, etc. So if we go a little bit further around, like 90 degrees, we're already into the greens. 180 degrees is basically cyan, so we're halfway around the color wheel. 200. We're getting into blues, then we're going to get into purples, so 280, it's going to be some kind of purple. And eventually we get back to red, so as we get closer to 360, we're getting back around to red. Again, this is just another option for a way to specify colors. You can also do that in Photoshop. So if I go to my choices here, there's HSB sliders. So hue, I go around the color wheel, so you can kind of see it here. So it's like the spectrum or the rainbow. Saturation, how intense the color is, and brightness is the light-dark value. If I turn it off, it's always going to be black because I've turned off the lights, essentially. If I turn it all the way up, depending on my saturation, I can get white or I can get the color. And for whatever reason, Photoshop uses hue, saturation, and brightness, B. And the web uses HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness. But it's the same thing. So notice the first value is a degree, the second value is the percentage of saturation, and the last value is a percentage of brightness. In general, if you turn the brightness all the way up, depending on your saturation, in HSL, when you turn it all the way up, you're almost always going to get white. But The brightness is slightly different, but you don't worry about that too much. And also, with HSL, we can add an A and give it a transparency value. So same thing, we've made it half transparent. So basically the default white background is showing through, so it's making my color lighter. If it was over another color, that color would be showing through. Take that out and take out my A. There are other color systems, and if you go to W3 Schools website, you can go look through the color specifications and see all these various ways of doing it. But in general, for our purposes, the ones we use the most are probably color words. But color word is fine for something like white. We know what that is. But chocolate, like what if I'm in Photoshop and I want to match that color? I don't know what chocolate is. Like, that doesn't even look like chocolate to me. So the most precise system we have is RGB numbers. And again, the A is just alpha, so if you don't want transparency, you just use RGB numbers. So the first number is red, second number green, last number blue. And it just takes a use and experience to start to be able to visualize what these numbers mean. In the meantime, you can just type in numbers and see what you get. Or you can go into Photoshop and use color sliders to see exactly what colors you've got. You can look at the patch library in Photoshop, the swatches, and pick a color that way, and then check to see what the RGB values are. And so if I use one of these colors, for instance, I pick this and Option Delete, I fill the screen with the color and say, all right, well, I want to use that color on my web page. How do I know what it is? If you click on the foreground color icon down in the corner here, we get the color picker pops up, and it's got all these different ways of describing this color. It's got hue, saturation, brightness numbers. You could plug these in. It's also got the RGB values. So if I wanted exactly this color, these are the numbers I would put in my style sheet. So 237, 20, 91. I have to click OK. Right, 237, 20, 91. So 237, 20, 91. And that's going to use exactly that color for the background of my div here. Okay, I think that'll wrap this up. Again, if, for more information, I'd say go to the W3 Schools and look at all the various systems for using colors. But again, the ones we will use most frequently, words are fine for simple colors like red, green, blue, white, black. But if we want more control over more specific kind of colors, our best bet is going to be the using RGB numerical values. All right.